Welcome to another edition of Eye on the Issues. Joining me right now is Bill Tallen. Bill, we of course are going to be talking about schools in the state of Wyoming and what they can do to protect themselves, the teachers, the principals, the administrators, and of course, most importantly, the students. Give us a little bit of your background when it comes to that topic.
Well, I spent 30 years with the federal government, with the Department of Energy and a small part of the Department of Energy that's responsible for the security of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials. So as a federal law enforcement position operating in the public domain on transportation missions, air, road, rail. And that was essentially my professional introduction to law enforcement and security issues and self-defense issues. And when I left the government, I retired at the end of 2009, continued another 10 years in consulting work for the same agency. And then as my own daughter entered schools here in Wyoming, I discovered a movement afoot in the legislature to legalize the option for school districts to arm volunteer members of their staff for the protection of everybody in the school. And I jumped on board that.
And as a parent, but also as somebody that is familiar with law enforcement, how important do you think it is to have people that are in schools aware of how to use a weapon and how to protect people?
Well, I think it's entirely crucial because although there are so many different measures that schools or really any institution can take to reduce the likelihood of a shooting scenario, by definition, every time one of these shooting situations occurs, all of those preventive measures have failed. And at that moment, when shots are first fired, the first 5 to 10 minutes is when everything happens. All of the casualties, all of the horror of those situations pretty much resolves itself in the first 5 to 10 minutes. And if you don't have armed defenders on scene to put a quick stop to it, then you'll see the horrific consequences that we see again and again.
So let's take a look quickly at what you've learned and as you've heard read the media and maybe other sources about Nashville versus Uvalde, Texas.
Well, yes, I mean, two terrible examples. The situation in Uvalde, Texas, was actually very typical up to a certain point, and that is that police response to schools almost everywhere in America ranges between, we usually say at the outside end, 3 minutes to 15 minutes for the first police officer to arrive on scene. And you have to understand, that doesn't mean that they're stopping the situation. That means that someone has made a 911 call. You know, somebody heard gunshots and identified them as gunshots and not construction noise or a textbook dropped on the floor. So there's usually a time span before the 911 call is made. Then there's the dispatch process. Then there's travel time for the nearest police officer to arrive. Then he arrives in the parking lot. Maybe it's only one officer initially. He has to orient to the problem, move to the location of the problem, and then neutralize the shooter. So it's highly optimistic to say that that's going to begin in 3 minutes. It very seldom does. So 3 to 15 minutes before you get police even imaginably able to actually intervene and stop a shooting. So the difference that we're looking for in our programs is to have armed, trained personnel on scene in the building that can be intervening in a matter of seconds, in some cases, a minute or two at most. And what we've seen, in studies of school shootings in particular and mass shootings in general, is that what we call the critical response gap between the time the first shot is fired and the time that someone is there to put an end to the situation is the critical thing, because there's a new victim every 7 or 8 seconds that the shooter is active. So the shooter has to be stopped at the earliest possible moment.
So let me cut you off for a second and let me ask you this question. What went through your mind once you heard about how things really played out in Uvalde, Texas?
Well, the problem there, and I hate to say it, but the problem there was entirely a matter of training and moral and physical courage on the part of responding law enforcement. I've worked with local, county, state, federal law enforcement from dozens of different agencies over the last 30 years. Most of them are very, very dedicated to their mission, and they train as well as their departments or their agencies allow them to train. But that day, everything went wrong. And the images that we have of literally scores of armed law enforcement officers on scene and none of them willing to open that door and go through it and stop that shooter is just appalling.
Let's compare and contrast that to what happened in Nashville.
Well, in Nashville, the police response was a whole lot faster. Most folks, have probably seen the body cam, video that was shot. Officers responded about as quickly and aggressively as police officers possibly can in a situation like that, and resolved the situation about as fast as it was humanly possible to resolve it when it's being done by officers arriving from off-site. They didn't delay. They acted with great determination, great speed, and nonetheless, we had that death toll on scene.
Yeah.
And that, and of course, it's hard to say. We were, of course, speculating about hypothetical conditions that might have been different. But had there been one or more individuals in that school who were armed and prepared, as educators almost invariably are, to defend the children and the other staff members who are present, then that situation could have been resolved even more quickly.
So let's jump ahead and let's talk about the state of Wyoming and what's been done from a legislative standpoint to allow schools and people within schools to protect themselves.
Well, the legislation, the enabling legislation in Wyoming was introduced in the 2017 legislative session, and it was a very well conceived law, very similar to laws we find in at least half a dozen other states around the country right now. In that it placed the responsibility for the decision, the commitment to this program, squarely in the hands of each individual school district. So the school boards, the trustees of the school boards of a given district, were basically told that they need to discuss this issue, formulate a policy, debate it, invite public participation, pass that policy, and implement it. That was the idea behind this legislation. So what the state did was it provided essentially the legal authorization for school districts to make that decision if they so choose. The thing that is that applies everywhere in every venue in America is a federal law that was passed in the mid-1990s called the Gun-Free School Zones Act, which some people, and myself among them, kind of consider an example of federal overreach. But the intent was to establish, and this is what they did. When you see the signs, they established a gun-free zone in a 1,000-foot radius of every school property in America. That law is on the books. It has weathered court challenges and remains in force. So what's necessary to do what we've done in Wyoming and many other states have done is to use exclusions in that federal law that allow weapons to be possessed by people who are licensed by the state to carry a weapon. And the courts have determined that that state license can in fact be a concealed carry permit if the state law that governs concealed carry in that state explicitly allows either all permit carriers or a subset of permit carriers to carry in schools. So what Wyoming did, I mean, in brief, what Wyoming did is say, if the school has a vetting and selection process and approves particular individuals for this program, and those individuals have a state concealed carry permit, then they're entirely legal carrying in the schools.
So since that legislation was passed, do you happen to know how many schools in the state have actually allowed guns to be, or their teachers or their administrators to be armed?
We currently, to my knowledge, have 5 school districts in the state of Wyoming. I hold training contracts from 3 of those districts. I provide the training to the selected individuals in 3 of those school districts, and there are 2 others that are also active. I know that those policies are being discussed in several other districts currently, but it's only the 5 that have passed them so far.
Have you gotten much pushback in those districts from possibly some activists or even some parents that aren't fans of having weapons in schools?
Oh, every district where the subject is raised, there is opposition, and we had a lot of that in Cody, where I am. We were the first district in the state to entertain a policy to implement that law, and the debate was very vigorous for a good long time. And it was, interestingly enough, it was resolved when the school board was sort of at an impasse. It was uncertain whether they were going to vote to pass the policy, considering the level of opposition they were hearing. So they commissioned a public opinion survey, a very well-designed public opinion survey. They had staff from the University of Wyoming and the University of Montana with experience in doing public polling, and they ran this survey among all voters in the school district, and the response was overwhelming. The community supported passage of the policy by almost 75%. And the people overseeing that process said this was one of the most reliable and predictive public opinion surveys they'd ever seen, based on sample size and the number of returns received. And so that's what settled the issue in our local community, was that the public was actually very strongly in support, and the board went ahead and passed the policy, and we've been running ever since.
So once you get the green light from a district, what's the next step to implementing this type of program?
Well, a lot of the work will be done at that point. The policies, the basic requirements for their individual policies are set out in the state law, but there's a tremendous amount of elaboration necessary in the course of writing their policy. So by the time the district passes the policy, they're ready to proceed, and that means close coordination with local law enforcement, usually a municipal police department and the county sheriff, and then a request for proposals to find vendors like myself who provide training. And then they will usually do a competitive process to select a trainer. And then it's simply a matter of scheduling and conducting the initial training for the first batch of staff members who are approved.
And let's talk about the staff members. Traditionally or historically, from what you've seen, how many are interested in I would imagine there's probably only a small number, I would say maybe 20 to 30% at best, that are interested in doing this, or are there more? Am I wrong?
Well, based on what we've actually seen, I would say the number is even less. What we say, what my firm says, based on our analysis of the vulnerabilities and the threats involved here, is if we actually had participation, if we had trained armed individuals at a rate of 5 to 10% of the staff in any given school building, we'll be good, because typically that means that you will have anywhere from 3 to 5 or more individuals in each building, which gives you a very strong possibility that 2 or 3 of them at least are going to be at work, on a given day. And that, in our view, is sort of the critical mass. That's what you need to be truly safe. And in the school districts that I work with, we are at or close to that level. It's a difficult thing really to tabulate, because I know from working with the individuals I know in the programs and from working with administration in the school districts, there is a wider level of interest, but there are several factors that intervene. There's some disincentives involved in terms of the time and effort that people have to put into training and maintaining their skills, the expenses, the out-of-pocket expenses that they incur to sustain their training and their proficiency, the level of support and encouragement that they get from their school board and from their local administration. All of those figure into the choice to go ahead and join the program.
And so for those that do actually end up having either carrying or having access to a weapon, let's talk about that. Do they actually end up carrying a weapon on their person, or are they do they have a weapon that's somewhere near them?
They in the 3 districts that I work with, both options are provided in policy. They can either carry securely holstered on their person at all times, or they can, by policy, store the weapon in a locked security container. I don't know of a single district that has actually implemented that. There's some really problematic issues about having a weapon in a safe. If you're not close to it, then what good is it? Right. So, we strongly recommend, we certainly don't have any authority over how these policies are implemented, but we strongly recommend that the people who volunteer be willing to carry a weapon deeply concealed on their person at all times.
So for anybody out there that's going to be watching this, and let's say they're in a district and they're a parent and they're not sure what their district's stance is, and let's say it's one that hasn't voted in favor of this. What do you suggest to them? How can they go ahead and start spearheading, moving in the direction of having teachers that can protect their kids?
I think it has to start with direct communications from parents and from other taxpayers and voters in their district directly to the trustees of the school board and express an interest, because the school board has to approach this the way they would any other policy on any other topic affecting their district. They have to begin discussions. They have to draft a policy. They have to go through a process. Usually in Wyoming, it's 3 separate votes, 3 readings and 3 votes before final approval. So, if they start from scratch, having never talked about it before, it's probably going to take 6 months to a year to get the policy actually fully drafted, reviewed, debated, voted on, and in place. But it starts with a phone call or an email to your school board members.
And from what you know of the districts, the 5 districts in the state of Wyoming that have allowed administrators or teachers to be armed, have those weapons ever needed to be pulled out?
Never, not once. In fact, of all states that I know of that have similar laws and similar programs, I do not know of a single case where the weapon has ever been displayed, much less used. There and a lot of the fears and opposition that we encounter early on in these discussions take the form of, well, gosh, we're afraid that there could be a negligent discharge or an accident, or someone will leave a weapon unattended, or a child will assault a teacher and take the weapon away, or the teacher may just, suffer, a mental health incident and themselves go off and shoot someone who doesn't deserve to be shot. And I do not know of a single case anywhere in America where that has actually happened. Any of those things.
Okay. So if you could, for parents that are kind of on the fence about this, just give us like a 30 to 60 second reason why it's beneficial to have a program like the one you offer in schools.
Well, the fundamental thing is, and I'll go back to something I said earlier on, all of our schools have pretty extensive safety and security policies. We have detection and prevention programs where we try to identify people who might perhaps be a threat or present a threat of some kind of violent act. And when we identify those people, we attempt to intervene with mental health professionals, sometimes with law enforcement, with counseling within the schools, and all these actions that can identify and perhaps prevent things from taking place. We also depend on all of our policies, those policies and our physical security measures, where we restrict access. We have a single point of access to the school. Those points of access are monitored. Doors are locked during the day, those sorts of things. All of those add up to a certain level of deterrence and discouragement to anyone considering a violent act. But again, in every case that we have a shooting in the school, all of those measures have failed. And so they're not foolproof. So what we're talking about is essentially a last line of defense on that day, when someone with ill intent is not stopped or deterred by any of those other measures. And when that day comes, the question is, are you willing to let a person like that have the run of the school and work their will on everyone in the school, children and adults alike, for 5 or 10 minutes, or would you rather have someone in the building able to intervene and stop them immediately?
So when these shootings do happen, and they do, and you hear people come out, and the first thing that some do is call for the removal of guns. Are we dealing with a gun problem in this country or a mental health problem?
Well, it's entirely, in my view, a mental health problem. I know I heard at one point in the debate here in my own district in Cody, the opinion, you'll often hear it stated this way about how, guns in schools or more guns in schools can't possibly be a solution to the problem. And my answer was, when a shooting occurs in your school, the first thing you're going to do is call for people with guns to show up and resolve that problem. And there's no difference here, because we're talking about people screened, carefully vetted, approved after a pretty arduous selection process, and then completing training that is right on par with the best training that law enforcement officers receive. So we're not going to make weapons go away. I mean, that's a bigger debate, but the fact of it is that no measures we could take, even the most draconian, gun control laws that could imaginably pass in our state or anywhere in the nation, are not going to remove weapons that are already in private hands and on the streets. And a person who intends to do ill with a firearm is going to have access to a firearm one way or another, and we need to protect our children. against that threat.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, I think the information you shared was needed for many parents, needed for many communities. Is there anything I'm not asking you about that you would like to add?
I think that's the essence of it right there. There are many, many issues and many considerations that come into implementing a policy like this, but all of them will arise in reasoned discussion once the process is initiated. So, talk to your trustees, talk to your school boards, express your concern. Make sure that they know and that you know what the state statute requires, and contact. And what I would suggest for trustees and for administrators of a school district is it's very easy for them to discover which districts have these policies in place. Some of them now 4 years of experience with these policies. Contact those districts directly. Talk to the administrators and the trustees in those districts. And I'll talk to anybody, as a trainer, and I don't expect to necessarily, be interested in the training business for any other additional districts, but I will be happy to sit down and talk to anyone, and provide them my perspective from 4 years of training these folks.
And is there a website they can use to contact you, or an email that you might want to share?
Yes, distributedsecurity.com. Okay, is the email domain. So Bill, my first name, at distributedsecurity.com is a quick and direct way to contact me. The one thing I would add, Mike, that we didn't mention before, is that one of the requirements of Wyoming state law, and reflected in every district policy, is that the identity of staff members who are carrying firearms is closely held. It's confidential. No one will know who those individuals are except their direct administrators, local law enforcement, and myself as a trainer, or whoever the trainer may be, of course. We're aware of their identity, but we have legal and contractual obligations to protect those identities. So, the way I apply that is when I get inquiries, and I do periodically, because people know that I do this training, and so they will ask me, and I'll say, look, I will sit down with you. I'll talk to you on the phone, or we can sit down face to face. I'll answer every question I can possibly answer. The only thing that I cannot do is identify the people who are already active in this program, but I can talk to you about the training, the requirements, and the success thus far of the program. And if you want to talk to me about that, I will not share your identity with anyone else, because if you later volunteer for the program and it's known that you were making such inquiries, then that could lead to a breach of your confidentiality. And I say from the get-go, I will protect your confidentiality, even if you are just trying to gather information and learn about the program.
Sure. Well, Bill, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you sharing everything you did.
Mike, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.